By the time I got the text, I was already in my pajamas, watching the late news with a glass of water and a bag of pretzels on the coffee table. That's the picture of retirement nobody tells you about. 63 years old, sitting in a quiet house in Bend, Oregon, with the only real excitement being whether the weather report would show snow by Thursday. Then my phone buzzed. 3 words. That's all it was. 3 words my daughter and I had agreed on almost 2 years earlier, sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, when she'd told me, for the first time, that things with her husband weren't what they seemed. Aunt May called. We don't have an Aunt May. Never did. That was the whole point. I was on my feet before I'd even consciously decided to move. I'd spent 26 years as a special agent with the FBI, most of it working violent crimes and kidnapping cases out of the Portland field office. My body still remembered certain things, even when my brain was slow. I had my keys, my jacket, my shoes on, and I was backing out of the driveway in under 90 seconds. My son-in-law never knew any of that, by the way. He thought I was a retired insurance adjuster. My daughter had told him that early on, and neither of us ever corrected it. That detail matters. You'll understand why in a little while. Her name is Lena. She's 34 years old, and she has her mother's eyes. Dark brown with a little bit of amber near the center, like someone held a candle up close. Her mother, my wife June, passed away from ovarian cancer 7 years ago. I mention that not for sympathy, but because it explains why Lena and I developed the kind of closeness that most fathers and daughters arrive at too late, if ever. Grief has a way of pulling people toward each other or driving them apart. We let it pull us together. She met her husband, Garrett, about 4 years after June passed. He was handsome in a deliberate way, the kind of man who knows exactly how he looks in a room and arranges himself accordingly. He sold commercial real estate and made good money at it, and he had a way of talking about his accomplishments that somehow made you feel like you'd complimented him first. I noticed these things, but I didn't say much. Lena was happy, or seemed to be, and she was an adult. It's not a father's place to narrate his daughter's love life just because something feels off. They got married in the fall, at a vineyard outside of Walla Walla. It was a beautiful day. In the wedding photos, Garrett is grinning like a man who just closed a deal. The first time I really saw the other side of him was at Thanksgiving. About 8 months into the marriage, I'd driven down to Eugene, where they lived, and we were eating dinner, and I made some comment. I don't even remember what it was, something about a local news story. And Garrett looked at Lena and said, very quietly, "Did you put enough salt in this?" She had. She always seasons food perfectly. But she immediately apologized and got up to get the salt shaker, and I watched the way she moved across that kitchen. Fast, careful, trying not to take up space, and something landed in my stomach that I couldn't shake for the rest of the meal. I didn't say anything then either. There were other moments over the next 2 years. The way he'd talk over her when she started a sentence. The way she'd check his expression before answering a question I'd asked her. Once I called her on a Tuesday afternoon and she answered in a whisper and said she'd call me back. And when she did, 2 hours later, she sounded like a different person. Lighter, brighter, like she'd turned a dial up. Garrett had left to play golf, she told me. I pretended not to notice the implication. The Sunday she came over and I finally asked her directly. She cried for 40 minutes before she said a single word. It hadn't been physical. Not yet. But the list of what it had been was long enough to fill that whole afternoon. The monitoring of her phone. The way he'd spend money on himself without consulting her and then question every purchase she made. The comments about her weight, her cooking, her intelligence, her family. The night he'd screamed at her for 2 hours over a dry cleaning receipt, and then, the next morning, acted as if nothing had happened. The time he'd thrown a coffee mug against the wall, not at her, he'd been careful about that, just near her. Just close enough. She hadn't told me because she was ashamed, because she thought it would get better, because she was afraid I'd do something and make it worse, because she still loved him, or loved the person she thought she'd married, which is a different kind of love, and a harder one to let go of. I listened. I didn't rush her. When she was done, I refilled her tea and I said, I want to set something up with you. Something just between us. A signal Something that sounds ordinary, that he'd never question. That means you need me there right now. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "What would it be?" I thought about it. "Aunt May. Text me those 2 words. Aunt May called, and I'll be there. I don't care what time it is. I don't care where I am. I'll be there. You live 45 minutes away, Dad." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. We also agreed that she'd think carefully about next steps, counseling, legal options, what she wanted her life to look like. I gave her the number of a domestic violence advocate I trusted from my years in the bureau. I didn't push. I'd learned, in 2.5 decades of watching people in crisis, that pushing rarely helps. People move when they're ready. Your job is to make sure the door is still there when they decide to walk through it. That was 19 months before the text message. In those 19 months, things shifted. Lena did go to counseling quietly on her lunch breaks. She started setting small amounts of money aside in an account Garrett didn't know about. She was building something, incrementally, the way you build anything that matters, one careful piece at a time. Their son, Cooper, had just turned 3. He's a sturdy little boy with his mother's eyes and a laugh that comes from somewhere deep and genuine. The kind of laugh that makes you feel like the world still has good things in it. He'd started calling me Grandpa G, which stood for Grandpa Gerald, though I'd told him he could just say Grandpa. He was 3. He had his own system. I mentioned Cooper now because he was there that night. In his room, asleep, when the text came. I want you to know he was there from the beginning of this story, even if I haven't said so until now. He was always there. He was part of why Lena had waited as long as she had. And part of why she finally didn't. According to what she told me later, Garrett had come home that evening from a work dinner that had clearly become something other than dinner. Not a client event, something personal, something he didn't explain. He smelled like bourbon, and a particular kind of carelessness that comes when a man thinks he doesn't owe anyone an accounting of himself. Lena had said something. She wasn't even sure what. Something small. Something about picking up Cooper's prescription the next day, and he'd grabbed her arm, hard enough to leave a mark. That was the first time he'd ever touched her in anger. She'd walked into the bathroom, locked the door, and sent me 3 words. Aunt May called. I drove 47 miles in 38 minutes. I know because I checked the clock when I left and when I pulled onto their street. I am not going to tell you. I obeyed every traffic law on that drive. I did not. Their house was lit up. Living room light on, 1 lamp upstairs. Garrett's truck was in the driveway. I parked on the street, walked to the front door, and knocked. He answered. Shirt untucked, glass of something in his hand, the particular expression of a man whose evening has already irritated him and who is not glad to see you. Gerald, he said. He never called me Dad or Pop or anything like that. Always my name, like a business contact. It's late. I know, I said. I was nearby. Is Lena around? Something moved across his face, a flicker of recalculation. He stepped back and let me in. She was in the kitchen, standing near the counter, with her arms crossed over her chest. And when she saw me, she went very still, in the way that people go still when they've been bracing for something, and suddenly feel the brace give way. Her eyes were dry. She'd been crying, but she'd stopped. And now she was holding herself together the way you do when you can't afford to come apart yet. I looked at her. I said, "Hey, sweetheart." That was all. Then I turned to Garrett. He'd followed me in and was standing with his arms slightly out from his sides. That posture some men take when they want to occupy more space than they actually have. He was 6 feet, maybe 200 pounds. He spent money on a gym membership that he used enough to stay credible. I am 63 years old. I am 5'11". I look, according to my daughter, and several other people who feel comfortable being honest with me, like a man who coaches high school football and argues about the weather. I have gray at my temples and a scar on my left hand from a fishing accident in 1987, and I was wearing plaid pajama pants when I got the text, which I'd had just enough time to change out of. Garrett looked at me the way he always had, like a man assessing a piece of furniture that was mildly inconvenient. "I think you should stay," I said to Lena. I was still looking at Garrett. "In the kitchen, I mean, just for a minute." She understood. She didn't move. I said, "Garrett, I'd like you to sit down." He laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "I'm not going to sit down in my own house because you—" I'm not going to describe in detail what happened next, partly because it was over quickly, and partly because this isn't that kind of story. What I'll say is that 26 years of bureau training, a background in combatives that predated my law enforcement career, and the very specific clarity that comes when a father's daughter sends him a 3-word text message in the middle of the night. All of that produces a particular kind of outcome. Quickly. He was on the floor, and I was kneeling beside him with his wrist secured behind his back before he'd finished his sentence. I wasn't rough beyond what was necessary. That's important to me. I've spent most of my adult life understanding that restraint is a skill, not a weakness, and that how you handle a person in a moment like that says something about who you are. Not just who they are. I said quietly, near his ear. Don't. He didn't. I had my phone in my other hand, and I'd already called 911 before I knocked on the door. The deputies arrived 4 minutes later. By that time, Garrett was sitting in a kitchen chair. Not because I was holding him there, but because he'd gone quiet in a way that suggested he understood. Finally, that the evening had moved outside the territory of situations he knew how to manage. The 2 deputies who came to the door were both younger than my son-in-law. One of them looked at the scene, looked at me, looked at Garrett, and said, "Sir, are you law enforcement?" "Retired," I said. "FBI, 26 years. Garrett turned his head and looked at me. There it was. That was the look. The specific, recalibrating, pieces falling into place look of a man who had spent 4 years assembling a version of his father-in-law that bore no resemblance to the actual person. The insurance adjuster. The quiet older man who showed up to holidays with a casserole dish and nodded along during football games. The soft target. I didn't say anything. I just held his gaze for a moment. Then I turned back to the deputies and gave them everything they needed. Cooper woke up while the deputies were still there. Lena heard him on the monitor. He'd slept through most of it, because the house had stayed quieter than Garrett's evenings usually got, and because Cooper, at 3, slept like a person who had not yet learned to be watchful. She went upstairs and got him, and when she came back down he was on her hip, confused and warm, and clutching a stuffed elephant named, as near as I could tell, Eel. He saw me and reached out both arms. I took him. He fell back asleep against my shoulder in about 40 seconds. I stood in my daughter's kitchen holding my grandson while the deputies finished their paperwork. And I want to be honest with you. That was the moment I came the closest to losing my composure. Not the text. Not the drive. Not the situation with Garrett. It was standing there holding that boy, feeling his warm weight against my neck, knowing what this house had been like and what it was going to become. Garrett was taken into custody that night. The charge was domestic assault. Lena had photographs of her arm that she'd taken in the bathroom before she sent me the text. She'd thought ahead. This daughter of mine. She'd thought ahead even in the middle of her worst night. And the deputies were thorough. He spent the night in the Lane County Jail, which is a sentence I confess I take some quiet satisfaction in. In the weeks that followed, Lena stayed at my house in Bend, her and Cooper, while she figured out the next steps. My house suddenly had crayon drawings on my refrigerator and a stuffed elephant named Ale under my coffee table and small shoes by the front door. And I want to tell you that I minded not at all. Not even a little. The pretzels in the evening news felt like something from another life. She filed for divorce. She had a lawyer, a woman named Sharon something, sharp and patient and exactly the kind of person you want in your corner. She also had, I should mention, those 19 months of careful, quiet preparation, the savings account, the records she'd kept, the counseling notes. She had built herself a door, and now she walked through it. The part I haven't told you yet is the hearing. 3 months after that night, there was a preliminary hearing for the assault charge. Garrett had hired a defense attorney, a smooth-talking man from Portland, who I suspect charged more per hour than I made in a week during most of my bureau career, and who had cultivated the particular ability to make simple situations seem enormously complex. I was asked to testify about what I'd witnessed. I came prepared. I'll tell you what I wore because it matters. I wore my suit, the dark navy one I keep for occasions that call for a certain seriousness, and my old bureau credentials and my retirement commendation letter, which outlined, in the particular dry language of federal documentation, the cases I'd worked over 26 years. One kidnapping case that made the national news. 2 organized crime investigations that resulted in prosecutions that you'd recognize if I named them, which I won't. A citation for actions taken in an armed confrontation in 2009 that I'd rather not revisit in detail. I sat in that witness box and I watched Garrett's face while the prosecutor introduced my credentials. The insurance adjuster, the quiet man at holidays, the soft, old father-in-law. His attorney tried, I'll give him that. He suggested that my restraint of Garrett had been excessive. He suggested that I had no way of knowing the full context of the domestic situation. He suggested several things, each of which I answered carefully, factually, and with the kind of evidentiary precision that 26 years in federal law enforcement tends to produce. The judge asked me, at one point, how I had managed to restrain a man 20 years younger and 40 pounds heavier without causing injury to either party. I said, training, Your Honor, and practice. She looked at me over her glasses. I think, though a federal courthouse is not the place for such things, that she was suppressing a smile. Garrett took a plea deal. Guilty to a reduced charge, community service, mandatory counseling, a protective order that meant he could not come within 500 feet of Lena or Cooper. He paid for his own attorney. The commercial real estate business turned out to be somewhat less robust than he'd represented, which came out in the divorce proceedings, which is a different story, and Lena's to tell, not mine. The last thing I want to tell you about is a conversation I had with Lena on a Saturday morning, about 5 weeks after that night, when she and Cooper were still staying with me, and Cooper was in the living room, watching dinosaur cartoons, and Lena and I were at the kitchen table with coffee. She looked at me and said, Dad, why didn't you ever tell him? About the bureau. I thought about it. I said because it wasn't his business. She waited. She knew me well enough to know there was more. And, I said, because a man who treats a woman well doesn't need to know her father can take him apart. The threat doesn't matter if the behavior is already right. And if the behavior is wrong. I paused. Then the information is more useful as a surprise. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is extremely FBI of you. I conceded that point. She also said something else that I've thought about since. She said, I waited too long, didn't I? It wasn't really a question, but I answered it anyway. You waited as long as you needed to, I said. That's different. She looked at me. You had to be ready, I said. And you built yourself the ability to be ready, the money, the records, knowing your options. That's not waiting too long. That's doing it right. She nodded slowly. Then she said, you know what Garrett called you? Before he knew, he called you the old man. Like in conversation. Your old man is coming to dinner. I considered this. He wasn't entirely wrong, I said. I am fairly old. And I am, in fact, a man. She laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd heard from her in what felt like a very long time, and it sounded like her mother's laugh, and I had to look out the window at the backyard for a moment until I could trust my face again. From the living room, Cooper announced at significant volume that the dinosaur on the television had made a very bad decision. We both agreed with him. Then we finished our coffee. There's a thing that happens when you reach a certain age that people who are younger sometimes mistake for diminishment. You go quieter. You stop needing to perform. You've already done most of what you're going to do, and you know what it cost, and you carry that differently than a young man carries ambition. People look at you and they see the gray in the stillness, and they make their calculations. Let them. I spent 26 years learning that the most dangerous people in any room are usually the ones who aren't trying to look dangerous. I spent 26 years learning to move carefully and speak precisely and choose the exact right moment. I spent 26 years watching what happens when people are underestimated. The ones who are underestimated and the ones who do the underestimating. Garrett thought he knew who I was. He had 4 years of evidence, all of it pointing toward a quiet, unremarkable man who showed up at holidays and asked polite questions about his career. He constructed his father-in-law from those pieces, and he was confident in the construction. He wasn't wrong about the pieces. He was wrong about what they added up to. My daughter sent me 3 words on a Tuesday night in November, and I drove 47 miles in the dark, without hesitating once. Not because I was trying to prove anything. Not because I needed him to know what I was capable of, but because she needed me there, and I was her father, and that has always been the only credential that actually mattered. The rest was just background.